The alien with the silver hands was trying to put me under, and I would not go. That is the part they never understood, the part that ended up in the record 3 different times, because none of them could square it with the readings. The sedative line was already in my arm, a clear tube running into a port they had drilled through the skin without asking. And the surgeon, they called her a reconstructionist, a Mehl female with 4 arms and eyes the color of wet slate, kept doubling the dose and, watching the number on her display, refused to fall. I was lying on a float table in a field hospital that smelled of cold metal and burned antiseptic. My left leg open to the bone below the knee, and I was awake. Not heroically awake, just awake. The way you are awake when something hurts, and you have decided, a long time ago and for reasons you no longer examine, that hurting is simply a thing that is happening to you and not a thing that gets a vote. She said something to the technician beside her. The translator in the ceiling caught it a half-second late and rendered it in that flat, institutional voice they used for everything. The metabolic uptake is correct. The compound is in his blood. He should not be conscious. I turned my head. It took effort. The muscles in my neck were one long cramp, and I looked at her 4 hands working inside my leg, and I said, "You can keep going, I won't move." That was the wrong thing to say. I understand that now. To them, it was not reassurance. It was the first data point in a file that would eventually be read aloud in front of a tribunal of their senior medical authority. A file titled, in their language, with a phrase the translator could only approximate as anomalous pain threshold, subject H9, and then under that, in smaller characters, a second phrase that I am told does not translate cleanly at all, but means roughly the thing that should have stopped him. I was H9. There had been 8 before me, all aliens, all from the convoy we had been pulled out of, and all of them had gone under like switched-off lamps. I was the 9th, and I was the one who would not switch off, and that is the whole story, really, though it took them 4 days and a great deal of frightened paperwork to believe it. Let me go back, not far. They hate it when you go too far back. The field hospital format wants the relevant interval only, and the relevant interval is small. We had been 3 days in the rock country east of the ridge when my leg went. I will not pretend it was glamorous. There was no last stand, no enemy at the wire. A slope gave out under me. Old volcanic shelf, the kind that looks solid and is a crust over nothing. And I went down 11, 12 feet into a seam, and my leg folded under me against a ledge on the way, and I heard it go. You always hear it. People say you don't feel it at first, and that is sometimes true, but you hear it, a wet green stick crack that your body files instantly under wrong. And then the world narrows to a tunnel, and your own pulse is very loud, and you have a few seconds of clarity before the leg starts to argue. I want to be precise about what happened in those seconds, because the Mehl asked me about them more than anything else. And because I think the answer is the part they were really afraid of. In those seconds, I did not panic. I did an inventory. Legs broken, lower, between knee and ankle, probably both bones, definitely the big one. Bones not out through the skin, good, that buys time. I'm in a seam. The rest of the squad is over the ridge and moving away from me on a schedule I do not get to interrupt without bringing the whole sweep down on us, and the rendezvous is roughly 11 miles south, at a culvert under a dead road. The math was very simple. Nobody is coming. The leg is broken. The rendezvous is 11 miles south. Therefore, I am going to walk 11 miles south on a broken leg. I did not decide this the way you decide what to eat. There was no deliberation. It was the only true sentence in the situation, and I simply read it off the situation the way you read a sign, and then I started doing it. I think that is the thing the reconstructionist could not hold in her 4 hands later. She kept circling back to the decision, as though there had been a moment where another path was open and I chose the brutal one out of some excess of will. There wasn't. There was no other path. The body does what the situation requires, or the body dies in a seam in the rock, and the body had already, long before I met any aliens, been trained out of treating that as a hard choice. I splinted the leg with the barrel of a rifle I was no longer carrying for any other reason, and 2 lengths of webbing, cinched until the bone ends stopped grinding against each other when I breathed, which is the bar you set in the field, not painless, just not grinding, and I climbed out of the seam using my arms and my good leg and the broken one as a dead prop I leaned the splint against when I needed a 3rd point of contact. Climbing out took, I would guess, 40 minutes. I have no exact figure. Time does a strange thing when you are managing pain at that level. It stops being a line and becomes a series of separate present moments, each one only as long as the next handhold. And then I walked. I tell it flat because it was flat. There is no music to it. You set the splinted leg down. You let it take a fraction of the weight. The leg screams. You note the scream the way you note weather. You take the next step. The trick, and I told the Mehl this, and she made the technician record it twice. The trick is that pain is information, and information does not require obedience. The leg was telling me, very loudly and with great conviction, that I should stop. I heard it. I did not argue with it. I simply declined to act on it. People think pain tolerance is about not feeling. It is not. I felt every step. I felt all 11 miles. Tolerance is about the gap you build between the signal and the response, and you build that gap a long time before you need it. In cold rooms and longer marches, until the wire that runs from the pain to the panic is one you can simply choose not to close. That is the trait. That is the whole reveal. Though they dressed it up in scans and panels in a tribunal, a human can receive the full pain signal and decline to be governed by it. Not because the signal is weak, because the human is, in a specific and trainable sense, not afraid of it. The Mehl found me at hour 9 of the walk, though I did not know that was what was happening at the time. Their convoy had been hit the same day mine fell apart. Different fight, same bad country, and they had set up a forward aid station in a culvert 2 miles short of my rendezvous, which is to say they had set up exactly where I was already walking. I came over a rise at dusk, and there were lights below, the cool blue field lights they string on poles, and a cluster of their wounded laid out on float pallets, and a perimeter of their medics moving among them with the particular economy of people who have triaged before. I should have skirted it. By every rule I had, I should have gone around. But I had been walking for 9 hours on a leg that had stopped being a leg and become a column of fire I was carrying, and I made a decision that the reconstructionists later flagged as further evidence of the anomaly, though to me it was just fatigue making a small bet. I walked down into their light with my hands open. They did not shoot me. That surprised both of us. A medic, the first Mehl I ever spoke to, a smaller one they called a triage hand, with a voice box clipped to her throat that did the translating in real time, came toward me with a scanner already up, and she ran it over me from a few feet off, the way you would approach an animal you were not sure of. And I watched her, read the screen, and I watched the screen change her. She said, "You are walking." I said, "Yes." She said, "Your tibial structure is in 3 pieces. The largest displacement is here." She turned the scanner so I could see it, which I have come to understand was not for my benefit but a reflex. The way a person turns a photograph toward you when they cannot believe it themselves. "You have been walking on this for a while now," I said. "Is there a place I can sit down? I'd rather sit down than fall down." That sentence is in the record. They put it in the record. Of all the things I said across 4 days, that one comes up the most, and I have thought about why, and I think it is because it contained no drama at all, and that is what frightened them. A creature that had walked 9 hours on a leg in 3 pieces and whose only request was a preference, stated mildly, between 2 ways of getting off its feet. They sat me down. They did more than that. The triage hand called over 2 more of them and they got me onto a float pallet, and the larger one, the reconstructionist with the silver hands, her name, as near as the translator could carry it, was Vass, came and crouched over my leg and unwrapped my field splint, and I watched 4 medical professionals of a species I had been at war with go very quiet at the same time. It was not the break that quieted them. They had seen breaks. It was the splint. It was the rifle barrel and the webbing cinched to the precise tension that stops bone ends grinding, and the way I had packed the wound with a strip of my own undershirt. And the fact that all of this had been done, they could see by the patient, alone in a rock seam with the injury live and screaming, by a person who then stood up and walked. Vass touched the cinched webbing with one silver finger and said something the translator gave me as he field corrected it, while conscious. And another of them, off to the side, said the thing I would hear several more times over the coming days in several rooms, from several mouths. Why did he not stop? Not how. Why? They could measure the how. The how was in the scans, brutal and undeniable. It was the why that had no slot in their medicine, and the why is the trait, and the why is what this whole account is for. Vass decided to operate. I understand now that this was partly mercy and partly research, and I do not hold the research against her. In her place, I would have wanted to know too. They had a surgical bay, a hard-walled module they inflated at the back of the culvert, white-lit, sterile, much cleaner than anything we field fought out of, and they floated me into it, and that is where we began the part with the sedative line, and the silver hands and the number that would not fall. Here is what they did not expect, and what I had no way to warn them about, because I did not fully know it myself until I watched it happen on their faces. Mehl medicine, I gathered, runs entirely on the assumption that a sufficiently wounded body shuts itself down, that pain past a certain threshold simply switches the patient off, the way it switches off most things that live. Their sedatives are almost a courtesy. The body has usually done most of the work already by the time the drugs arrive. They had never, in the long institutional memory Vass kept citing, met a body that received the full signal and stayed at the controls anyway. Their dosing charts assumed cooperation from the pain itself. and my pain was not cooperating because I was not letting it. And so the chart broke, and a Mehl reconstructionist stood over an open human leg with a syringe of compound that should have ended the conversation and watched the patient. Watch her back. He should not be conscious, she said again, to no one. You keep saying that, I said. My voice was rough. I had been doing the breathing you do, the long, slow draw and the longer release, the metronome that keeps the gap open between the leg and the rest of me. I keep being conscious. One of those is going to have to give, and it isn't going to be the consciousness. Just do the work. I'll hold still, and I did. I held still while a four-armed alien rebuilt the inside of my leg with instruments I could feel and could not name, for what the record says was 51 minutes, and I did not move and I did not scream. And twice I asked her a question about what she was doing because I was curious, and both times the question landed in that bright sterile module like a stone dropped down a well, and the medics around the table went still and looked at each other in the particular way I have since learned means a species is recalibrating, something it thought it knew. When it was done, she did not bandage me and leave. She pulled a stool up, they have stools, low three-leg things, and she sat by my head and she asked me directly the question the side medic had asked the air. Why did you not stop? I was tired. The leg was rebuilt and packed and the fire had banked down to a deep ache, which after 11 miles felt almost like comfort. I could have given her something short. Instead, I tried to tell her the truth, because she had earned it with the 51 minutes, and because I had the sense, even then, that the truth was going to matter to a great many of her people who would never sit by my head. Because stopping was death, I said, and the leg was just pain. Those aren't the same size. People think they're the same size. They're not. The pain wants you to treat it like death, because that's its whole job. It's a smoke alarm. And a smoke alarm screams the same whether the toast burned or the house is gone. The trick is, you learn to walk into the kitchen and check before you run out of the building. That's all I did. I checked. The leg was the toast. The seam was the house. So I walked. The translator labored over that. I watched her take it in pieces. Then she said slowly, your kind can separate the signal from the danger it reports. Most of us can learn to, I said. Some of us get trained hard at it. But the wiring's in everybody. It's not a gift. It's a discipline you can teach a child. The child won't like it, but you can teach it. She was quiet for a long time. Then she said the sentence that I think started everything that came after. The panels, the records, the senior board. The eventual quiet redrawing of how a whole branch of their military thought about my species. She said, then we have been winning these engagements on a premise that is not true. We have been assuming that when we wound a human badly enough, the human stops. Yeah, I said. I'd let that one go up the chain if I were you. She did. That is the thing about the Mehl, whatever else they were. They were honest record keepers. And Vass took the file up the chain with the discipline of someone who has decided the truth is more dangerous to hide than to share. She did not soften it. The compiled record, I saw a copy of it, much later, after the exchange that sent me home, opened with the raw figures and built from there, and the figures alone were enough to make the senior board pull her in for testimony. 3 pieces of bone, 11 miles, 9 hours, 51 minutes of conscious reconstruction. A sedative dosing curve that the chart said should have flatlined the subject at the second increment, and that instead just kept climbing while the subject asked polite questions about the procedure. I was not at that board, not at first. I was in a recovery module under guard, healing faster than they expected, because the body does that too when you let it, and Vass would come and sit with me at the end of her shifts and tell me, in her careful way, what was happening in the rooms I was not in. I think she had stopped seeing me as a prisoner somewhere around hour 51. I think she had started seeing me as a colleague in an investigation we were both now part of. The investigation being, what, exactly, are these things? They do not believe it, she told me one evening. The board. They have read my record and they do not believe a body can do this. They believe I made an error. They believe the sedative was contaminated, or the dosing was logged wrong, or the scans were of 2 different patients. She made the small clicking sound that I had learned was the Mehl version of a tired laugh. I have offered to demonstrate. I did not like the sound of that. Demonstrate how? They want to see it, she said. They want to wound a human and observe. They've got 8 dead aliens and 1 live human, I said. Tell them to read the difference. They don't need to break me again. I told them that, Vass said. I told them the difference is already in the record. They are senior. They prefer to see. She looked at me with the slate eyes. I will not let them open you again. I want you to know that. Whatever I am to my people, I set your leg, and a reconstructionist does not let her work be undone for a demonstration. But they will want to test the claim some other way, and I cannot stop them from asking. I can only tell you in advance so that you are not surprised. I appreciated that. I told her so. And I lay there in the cool blue light of a recovery module on a world I will never name to anyone, and I thought about the 8 dead aliens from my convoy and from theirs, all of whom had switched off when the pain got big enough, and I understood for the first time fully what it was that had quieted 4 medics over an open leg. It was not that I was strong. I am not especially strong. It was that I was, by their measure, broken in a way they had no word for. A thing that took the off switch the universe, installs in everything that suffers, and had simply deliberately learned to leave it alone. The test they settled on was not a wounding in the end, and for that I have always been quietly grateful to whatever passed for a conscience among them. It was a cold immersion. They had a tank, a deep cylinder of fluid they could chill to a precise temperature, used, Vass explained, to study the failure points of injured tissue, the moment at which a body of a given species could no longer maintain function and the off switch tripped. For their own kind, the curve was reliable to a fraction of a degree. They knew the exact cold at which a Mehl stopped. They had run it 10,000 times. The board's logic was simple and on its own terms sound. If the human's resistance to shutdown was a measurable property of the body and not an artifact of Vass's record-keeping, then the body would show it in the tank, on a curve they could not argue with, against a baseline they trusted. They asked me to do it voluntarily. That detail matters, and I want it kept. They could have compelled me. I was a prisoner of war on a world where I had no standing, but a delegate from the senior board, a tall stooped Mehl they called an adjudicant, came to my module and explained the procedure through Vass and asked formally whether I would consent. I think they had begun to suspect that the answer to what are these things might depend on watching one choose, and that compelling the choice would corrupt the result. So they asked, I said yes, I want that kept too. Not because I had no fear of it, I had plenty. Cold is an ugly way to die, and I knew the curve was built to find the place where a body gives up, but because Vass had told me, the night before, what the board still believed. They believed I was an error. They believed her record was a mistake. And I had decided somewhere in 9 hours of walking that I was done with anyone deciding what my species could survive without watching it survive. If they wanted the truth, they could have the truth, on a curve they trusted, in my own body, freely given. That is a kind of stubbornness that has nothing to do with courage. It is closer to spite. I have made my peace with that. They lowered me into the collarbone. The adjudicant watched from a gantry with 4 of the senior board, and Vass stood at the tank's edge with her silver hands flat on the rim and her slate eyes never leaving the readout. And a technician called the temperature down in increments, while a second technician called my vital signs. The cold came up my body like a tide of broken glass. I will not be poetic about it. It was agony of a specific escalating kind, first the skin, then the muscle, then a deep bone ache that made the rebuilt leg sing its old song, and under all of it the steady chemical alarm of a body that knows correctly that it is being killed. I felt every degree of it. That is the thing I keep returning to, the thing they could never quite accept. I was not numb, not transcendent, not somewhere else. I was right there, in the cold, in the full signal, and I did the only thing I have ever done, which is keep the gap open between the signal and the surrender, breath by breath, while a board of aliens watched a graph that was supposed to fall and did not. It did not fall. That is the whole of it. The Mehl baseline, the temperature at which their own kind tripped the off switch and shut down, came and went, and I was still talking. They had asked me to report my state aloud, through the translator, so they could correlate it. So I did. I said the cold was bad. I said my hands had stopped working. I said I could no longer feel the rebuilt leg, which was almost a relief. I said, when the technician's voice climbed into a register, even the flat translator could not fully neutralize. I'm still here. You can take it lower if you need to. I'd rather you got a clean number than had to do this twice. There was a silence on the gantry. I learned later what was in it. The technician had reported that we had passed not only the Mehl shutdown baseline, but the modeled shutdown baseline for every species the board had on file. That the readout was charting into a region the chart did not have lines for, a blank zone past the edge of the known, and that in that blank zone the subject was making a request, calmly, that they continue, because he was concerned about the cleanliness of their data. The adjudicant ended it there. He gave the order to raise me before the curve found its floor, and I have wondered, in the years since, whether that was mercy or whether it was simply that he could not bear to keep looking. They pulled me out and wrapped me in warming gel, and Vass had her 4 hands on me before I was fully clear of the fluid, working me back, swearing at me in a language the translator politely declined to render, and as the feeling came back into my body in waves of returning fire, I looked up at the gantry where the senior board of an alien medical authority stood frozen at the rail, and I watched the thing happen that I had been brought there, in the end, to make happen. I watched them stop believing the chart, The adjudicant came down from the gantry himself. That was not, Vass told me afterward, a thing adjudicants did. They sat above and they received reports. This one came down the gantry steps slowly, on legs that I think were not entirely steady, and he stood over my warming pallet and looked at me for a long while before he spoke, and when he spoke the translator gave it to me in that flat voice that could no longer hide what was underneath it. You asked us to take it lower. You needed a clean number, I said. My teeth were still chattering. The words came out broken. Half a number's no use to anyone. You just have argued about it for another month. You were past the floor of every species we have measured, he said. You were in a region of the model that does not exist, and you used that moment to express a concern about our data hygiene. Seemed like the useful thing to say, I said. He was quiet again. Then he asked the question. Not Vass's why, he had moved past why. He asked the question that I think the entire senior board had come down inside of him to ask, the question that was really about the war and about every engagement they had ever fought against my kind and every engagement they would ever fight. Again, how many of you can do this? And here is where I had to be careful, because the honest answer was the dangerous one, and I had decided long before the tank that I would give them the honest one anyway, because a lie at that moment would have been the one thing that could get more of my people killed. A species that thinks the trait is rare will keep wounding humans and waiting for them to stop. A species that understands the trait is baseline will think twice about starting. All of us, I said, to some degree, all of us. The wiring standard. What you saw in the tank, the far end of it, that takes training, and not everyone gets the training, and the ones who do paid for it in rooms you wouldn't want to hear about. But the basic thing, the gap between the pain and the panic. Every human alive has some of it. We teach it to children. We teach it to children, adjudicant. A small human with a scraped knee gets told gently that it hurts and that it's all right, that the hurt is information and not an emergency, and that is the first lesson in the same discipline you just watched at the bottom of your tank. You have been fighting a species that raises its young to be unafraid of pain. You have been wounding us and waiting for us to switch off. We don't switch off. We were never going to switch off. You have simply until now been killing the ones who hadn't yet learned not to. I have replayed that moment many times. I did not say it as a threat. I was too cold and too tired for threats. I said it as a man closing a ledger that had been open too long, laying the true figure down on the table at last so that everyone could stop, pretending the column added up to something it didn't. But it landed as a threat anyway, because the truth stated flatly by the thing that just walked out of your impossible tank is the most threatening shape a sentence can take. The adjudicant did not answer me. He turned to Vass and he gave an order, and the order, she told me later, was to seal the record, not bury it. Seal it in the sense of finalize it, lock it against revision, distribute it to every medical and military authority in their reach, with the chart and the curve and the blank zone past the floor, and the transcript of a human asking them to take it lower for the sake of clean data. He wanted it read. He wanted every commander who had ever ordered a human wounded and waited out to read what waited at the bottom of the tank. I have come to think that was the most ruthless thing he could have done, and the most honest, and that the two were the same thing. They sent me home not long after, in an exchange that I am not at liberty to describe, and that I suspect was hurried along precisely because of what I now knew about how their high command had changed its mind. I went home on a broken leg that had healed crooked and aches in the cold to this day, and every time it aches I think of the tank, and of Vass swearing at me in a language no machine would translate, and of an adjudicant who came down off his gantry on unsteady legs to ask one species how many of them were like the thing he had just failed to switch off. But I am getting ahead of the record, and the record is the point, so let me go back into it, into the days between the tank and the exchange, because that is where I learned what the trait did to them once it stopped being mine and became theirs to carry. The morning after the immersion, Vass came to my module with a second Mehl I had not met, an older male with a stoop worse than the adjudicants and a band of dull copper around one wrist that I would later understand marked him as their senior authority on comparative physiology, the closest thing they had to a man who studied how different living things break. They called him a demarcator. His work, Vass said, was to draw the lines, the temperature a body fails at, the blood loss a body survives, the dose that ends a given species. He had spent his whole long life drawing those lines, and he had come to my module because I had just stepped over one of them and kept walking, and a man who has spent his life drawing lines does not sleep well after that. He did not ask why I had not stopped. He had read the transcript. He had moved past why the way the adjudicant had. He sat on the low stool and he set a thin display panel on the floor between us, and he turned it so I could see, and on the panel were the 8 others, the 8 from the convoy, the dead. These are your companions, he said. The translator hesitated over companions. I do not think the Mehl word was quite that, but it was close enough and I let it stand. We recovered them with you. We have examined them. I want to show you something, and I want you to tell me if I have understood it correctly. Because if I have understood it correctly, then I have been wrong about a great many things for a very long time, and I would prefer to be wrong with a witness. I told him to go ahead. He showed me the scans. 8 bodies, 8 sets of injuries, and he walked me through them one at a time with the dreadful patience of a man building a case against himself. The first had a chest wound, survivable, he said. By Mehl standards, by the standards of every species he had on file. The body had shut down anyway. The off switch had tripped on a wound that should not have killed it. The second, a crush injury to one limb, again survivable, again shut down. The third, the fourth, the fifth. The same story 8 times. Wounds that, by his lines, his careful lifetime of lines, should not have been fatal, and bodies that had died of them anyway, because the pain had reached the threshold, and the threshold had done what the threshold does in nearly everything that lives. It switches the sufferer off. It is, the demarcator told me, a mercy the universe installs in its creatures, a circuit breaker against agony, and it is so nearly universal that he had built his entire science on the assumption that it could not be overridden. And then, he said, we recovered a 9th body. Yours, the same country, the same convoy, a worse injury than 4 of these 8. 3 pieces of bone. 9 hours of weight-bearing transit on the fracture. 51 minutes of conscious reconstruction. And a cold immersion past the floor of the model. He looked at me with eyes that had gone the color of ash. By every line I have ever drawn, you are the corpse on this panel, and these 8 are the ones who should have walked. The wounds say so. The thresholds say so. And yet you are sitting on my stool, asking me to go ahead, and they are on the panel. They're not human, I said. That's the whole difference. There isn't another one. I am beginning to understand that, he said. What I am trying to understand is what it means. Because if the off switch is a mercy, and it is a mercy, it spares the dying their final agony, then your kind has, at some point in its making, declined the mercy. You feel the full measure of every wound to the very end. You do not get the gift of being switched off. You walk 11 miles inside it instead. He was quiet, and then he said the thing that I think aged him in front of me. I had always thought the most dangerous creature would be the one that felt no pain. I built my lines for that creature. I looked for it for 60 years. I never found it. And now I see that I was looking for the wrong thing entirely. The most dangerous creature is not the one that feels nothing. It is the one that feels everything and comes anyway. I did not have anything to say to that. He had said it better than I could have, and he had said it about my whole species. And he had said it as a man laying down the work of a lifetime, because the work had turned out to be a wall he had built between himself and a true thing. He gathered up his panel after a while. At the door, he stopped and turned the stoop of his body toward me and said, I am going to add a line to the model, a new failure mode for your kind. Do you know what I am going to call it? No, voluntary, he said. The human failure threshold is voluntary. The body does not trip it. The mind declines to. I do not have a number for it. I do not think there is a number for it. I think it is wherever the human decides it is. And I think that is the most frightening sentence I have written in 60 years of writing sentences about how living things end. And he left, and I lay in the cool blue light and listened to the door seal behind him. And I thought, now they know. Now, at last, they actually know. The record did not stay in that field hospital. The demarcator's new line, the voluntary threshold, the failure mode with no number, went up the chain the way Vass's first record had, and it landed in a place I would not see for myself until much later, when a copy of the proceedings was given to me as part of the exchange, a courtesy I still do not fully understand, but I read it. I read all of it. And the part I want to set down here is the part where it stopped being about me and started being about a war. There was a hearing. Their senior military medical authority convened it, the same board that had sent the adjudicant, plus a wider body, commanders and logisticians and the kind of officials whose work is to decide what a war costs and whether it is worth the cost. The hearing was called, the transcript says, to address a single operational question, whether the standing doctrine of engagement against human forces required revision in light of the H9 findings. I will tell you what the standing doctrine had been, because it is the hinge of everything. The Mehl, fighting humans, had learned early that humans were physically unremarkable, no natural weapons, ordinary strength, soft bodies that broke about as easily as their own. So their doctrine had been economical and by their lights humane, wound, do not kill. A wounded enemy, their doctrine held, removes himself from the fight. The body's own circuit breaker does the rest. You do not need to expend the effort or the ordnance to kill a human. You need only to hurt him past his threshold. And his own physiology will take him out of the engagement. They had built an entire way of fighting around the off switch. They had been, in their terms, merciful, and the mercy had been efficient, and the efficiency had been the doctrine. And the H9 findings had just informed them that the off switch they had built their war around did not exist. You can imagine, or perhaps you cannot, but I will try to give it to you what that did in the room. The transcript is dry. The Mehl keep dry transcripts. But you can read the thing happening underneath the dryness. A logistician asks how many human engagements over the previous 9 years had relied on the wound and withdraw model. The answer is, nearly all of them. A commander asks how many human casualties classified as neutralized had been in fact merely wounded and left, on the assumption that the threshold would finish the work the Mehl had declined to finish. The answer comes back after a long recess, and the answer is a number I will not repeat because I do not entirely trust my own translation of it. But it was large, and the recess that produced it was long, and when the hearing resumed, the tone of the transcript had changed in a way that even a flat institutional record could not hide. Because here is what the number meant. It meant that for 9 years the Mehl had been wounding humans and walking away, confident that the threshold would do the rest, and a fraction of those humans, some fraction nobody had ever counted, had not switched off, had done what I did, had splinted the wound and kept the gap open between the pain and the panic and gotten up and walked, in the dark, away from the place the Mehl had left them for dead and come back. The doctrine had been generating survivors the doctrine insisted could not exist. The Mehl had spent 9 years seeding the battlefield with men they thought were corpses and who were, a fraction of them, simply walking home on broken legs to fight again. A commander in the transcript says it plainly, and the translator who prepared my copy rendered it cleanly, and I have never forgotten it. He says, "We have not been removing them from the war. We have been teaching the survivors that we will not finish them. We have been training an enemy to expect to be wounded and abandoned, and to plan around it. Every human we left for the threshold and who did not die is now a soldier who knows from his own body that our doctrine is a lie. We did not build a humane war, we built a school. That is, the moment the record turns. Not the tank, not the leg, not the demarcator's line with no number, this. A room full of an alien power's most senior people realizing that the central efficiency of their entire campaign had been quietly manufacturing, for 9 years, the most dangerous possible version of their enemy. The one who has personally survived the thing that was supposed to kill him, and knows it, and is no longer afraid of it because he has already been to the bottom of it once and walked out. Vass brought me the news of the hearing in pieces, the way she brought me everything, at the end of her shifts, on the low stool, in the cool blue light. By then we had fallen into something I would not have predicted on the day she ran a scanner over me from a safe distance. We had become, in the strange shorthand of 2 people working the same impossible problem from opposite sides, something close to friends. She was a surgeon, I was a soldier. We had each spent a career at the edge of how bodies fail, and we had each in our way been undone by the same discovery, and there is a kind of company in that which has nothing to do with whose side you are on. They have suspended the wound and withdraw doctrine, she told me one evening. Her 4 hands were folded in her lap. She had a way of folding them when the news was heavy. Effective immediately, across all human front commands, they cannot rely on the threshold, so they have to choose. Either they commit the ordnance and the effort to be certain of a kill, which doubles the cost of every engagement and changes the entire economics of the war, or they stop wounding humans they cannot finish because everyone they leave alive is, in the words of the hearing, a graduate. And which did they choose, I asked. They have not chosen, Vass said. That is the part I came to tell you. They cannot agree. Half the command wants to escalate, to make every human engagement a certain kill, whatever it costs, because a war against a thing that does not switch off cannot be won halfway. The other half has begun to ask a different question. She paused, and the slate eyes found me. They have begun to ask whether a war can be won at all against a species that raises its children to be unafraid of pain. Not whether it is expensive, whether it's possible. There is a faction in that room, small for now, but it was not there a month ago, that has started to use the word that the senior medical authority does not like to hear in a military hearing. They have started to ask whether the rational course is not victory, but withdrawal. I lay there and let that settle. I had not walked 11 miles to end a war. I had walked 11 miles to reach a culvert. But pain is information, and information travels, and the information I had handed them in a cold tank had traveled all the way up to the rooms where wars are ended, and it had begun to do in those rooms the only thing true information ever does. It had begun to make the lie they had been fighting on impossible to keep telling. I should not be glad of that, Vass said quietly. I am a Mehl. A withdrawal is a defeat for my people. I should grieve it. She unfolded one of her 4 hands and looked at it, the silver still bright on the fingertips. And yet, I set your leg. I sat by your head for 51 minutes. I pulled you out of a tank past the floor of the model, and I held you while the feeling came back, and you did not once in any of it ask me to make the pain stop. You asked me to do good work. You asked me for a clean number. She closed the hand. I find I cannot grieve the end of a war against a creature like that. I find I am relieved that someone in those rooms has finally said the word. I do not know what that makes me. I have decided not to examine it too closely. There was a long quiet between us then, the comfortable kind. Outside the module, the field hospital went about its work. The cool blue lights, the float pallets, the medics moving with their triaged economy among the wounded of a war that had just learned it might not be winnable. And I thought about the children. I had said it to the adjudicant as a fact, almost a boast, that we teach the discipline to children. But lying there in the aftermath of what the fact had done, I felt the weight of it differently. We do teach them. We teach a small human with a scraped knee that the hurt is information and not an emergency, and we think we are teaching them resilience, a kindness, a way to move through a world that hurts, and we are. But we are also, the Mehl had just discovered, building into every one of us, from the youngest age, the precise faculty that an alien power had spent 9 years and a great many lives failing to find a way around. We are raising, generation after generation without meaning to, the one thing their entire science of how living things end could not account for. The creature that feels everything and comes anyway. A commander came to see me before the second human ever arrived. Not a medic, a fighting officer, the first one I had met. And the difference between him and Vass was the difference between a doctor who wants to understand a thing and a soldier who wants to know what the thing will cost him. They called his rank something the translator gave as field master. He was broad even for a Mehl, scarred along one side of his face in a way their medicine apparently could not or chose not to smooth, and he came into my module without sitting down and stood over the pallet with his forearms folded and looked at me for a while the way you look at a weapon you have just learned is loaded. I have read the medical record, he said. I did not come to discuss the medicine. The medics can have the medicine. I came to discuss the war because I am the one who has been fighting it, and your record has informed me that I have been fighting it wrong for 9 years. And before I change how I fight, I want to hear the thing from the creature itself. Ask, I said. When we wound one of you and leave, he said, and the one we left gets up and walks. How long? How far? Give me the operational figure. The medic gave me a curve in a tank. I do not fight in a tank. I fight in country, over distance on a clock. Tell me what a wounded human can actually do in the field, so that I can stop being surprised by it. It was a fair question and an honest one, and I gave him an honest answer, because by then I had decided that honesty was the only weapon I had that could end this faster than fighting could. Depends on the wound and depends on the human, I said. But you want a planning figure, so here's one. Assume a human you've wounded and left is not out of the fight. Assume he's slow, assume he's hurt, assume he's leaking, and assume he is coming anyway, on whatever's left, for as long as it takes, toward whatever he was trying to reach when you hit him. I walked 11 miles on a leg in 3 pieces in 9 hours. That's not the record. I've known men do worse. Plan for 11 miles, Field Master. Plan for the wounded man you left behind you, walking 11 miles to be in front of you by morning. He took that without moving. To his credit, he did not flinch. He was a fighting officer, and he had come for exactly this, and he received it the way a professional receives bad weather. 11 miles, he said, on a broken leg. Through my own lines, which I would have considered secure because the only thing behind them was a man I had already shot. That's the one, I said. That's the hole in the doctrine. You secure your rear against threats. A man you've already wounded and written off doesn't read as a threat. He reads as a corpse that hasn't finished, so you don't watch for him. And then the corpse that hasn't finished walks through your secure rear in the dark, 11 miles from where you left it, and it is still trying to do the job it was doing when you shot it, because the job and the man are the same thing now, and the pain doesn't get a vote. I shifted the leg on the pallet. It ached, and I let it. You haven't been leaving wounded behind you, Field Master. You've been leaving a slow second wave. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms, and he did a thing I had not expected, and that no one translated, and that needed no translation. He inclined the broad scarred head a fraction, the smallest possible bow, the kind a fighting man gives another fighting man across a line he has just understood he should never have drawn so carelessly. And he said, I have lost officers to that slow second wave and never understood what killed them. I logged them as casualties of follow-on action. Enemy reinforcements. I never once considered that the reinforcements were the men I had already shot. He turned for the door. I will rewrite the rear security doctrine tonight, and I will tell my officers the new rule, and it will be a strange rule to give a soldier, and they will not like it. The rule is a wounded human is not behind you. There is no behind you. Plan as though every human you have ever shot is still walking towards you in the dark. He left. And I lay there and understood that the trait had reached the last room it needed to reach. Not the medics, who wanted to understand it, not the accountants who wanted to price it, but the fighting officer, the man with the scarred face who actually pointed the war, and that the fighting officer had just walked out of my module to teach his soldiers to fear the men they had already killed. They got a second human 3 days after the hearing, and I want to tell that part because the board's whole problem with my case had been that I was one subject, one curve, one stubborn man who would not switch off, and a stubborn man can be an outlier, a freak, a flaw in the sampling. The demarcator drawn his line with no number, but a line drawn from a single point is not a line at all, and the escalation faction in the command was using exactly that against the withdrawal faction. One human, they said. We are rewriting 9 years of doctrine on one human. Find us another. They found another. Not on purpose. A second extraction came through the Culvert Hospital. 4 human wounded pulled out of a fight to the north, and 3 of them were in the state the Mehl expected. Unconscious, the threshold tripped, the off switch doing its merciful work. But the 4th was awake. I was not allowed near her. They kept the human casualties separate from me. They were not so naive as to let 2 of us compare notes. But Vass told me, and the record I was later given confirmed it, and so I can set down what happened, though I never learned the woman's name and never saw her face. She had taken a fragment wound to the abdomen. Survivable, the demarcator said, but ugly, the kind of wound that hurts in a way that does not relent, a deep continuous burning that the off switch is specifically built to spare a creature from. The 3 men around her had been spared it. They had gone under. She had not. She had come to the Culvert Hospital conscious, with one hand pressed flat over the wound to hold the pressure, and the tridge hand reached her, she had said. Through the woman's own translator, the small unit a soldier carries, the single most useful sentence a triage nurse can hear, she had given her own assessment. She had told the Mehl medic where she was hit, how long ago, how much blood she thought she had lost, and which of the 3 unconscious men beside her should be worked on first because his bleed was worse than hers. The triage hand reported it up. She reported that the second conscious human, gut-wounded, in continuous pain that the model said no creature endures awake, had used her consciousness not to plead or to scream, but to triage her own squad, to rank the wounded, to direct the alien medics toward the man whose need was greater than her own. That report reached the demarcator and the adjudicant and the board, and it did to the escalation faction's argument exactly what a second point does. To a line drawn from one, it made it a line. 2 humans, 2 injuries, 2 contexts, the same impossible fact, the full pain signal, received and refused, the gap held open between the agony and the surrender. And in the second case, a thing the first case had only hinted at, that the human, freed by the discipline from being governed by the pain, does not spend the freedom on herself. She spends it on the man bleeding beside her. The demarcator added a note to his line, the record says. Under voluntary failure threshold, he wrote a second observation, and the translator gave it to me as, the freed attention is directed outward. He had expected, if the trait were real, to find a creature absorbed in its own endurance. He found instead a creature that, having declined to be ruled by its own agony, used the spare capacity to manage the survival of others. That frightened them more than your tank, Vass told me. The tank they could file under endurance, a hard creature, a tough creature, a creature that takes a great deal of killing. They have met tough creatures. But the woman with her hand on her own wound directing them toward her squad mate, that is not toughness. That is command. That is a creature whose pain does not even fully occupy it, that has attention left over, in the middle of being killed, to run the people around it. The board sat with that for a long time. And then someone in the withdrawal faction said, the sentence that I am told, ended the argument about whether you were an outlier. What did they say? They said, we have now sampled 2, and 2 for 2 have done the impossible thing, and the second did it, while also doing a second impossible thing on top of it. If the rate is 2 of 2, we are not looking at outliers, we are looking at the species. And if this is the species, then we have not been fighting soldiers who happen to be hard to kill. We have been fighting a population that, as a baseline trait, can take the worst we have and keep thinking clearly enough to run a battle through it. There is no doctrine for that. There is only the decision whether to be in a war with it or not. The adjudicant interviewed me one more time before the exchange. He came alone, without Vass, with only the ceiling translator, and he sat on the low stool with his stooped frame folded onto it, and he did not begin with a question. He began with a confession, which is not a thing I had expected from a senior official of a power I was at war with. I have spent my career, he said, deciding what wars cost and whether they are worth the cost. It is unglamorous work. I am not a commander. I do not win battles. I am the one who tells the commanders what the battle will take out of us, so they can decide whether to fight it. I am good at it. I have been good at it for a long time, and I have never until this month encountered a cost I could not estimate. He looked at me. You have given me one I cannot estimate. The cost of a war against a species whose limit is voluntary. I cannot put a figure on it. There is no figure. Every model I have ends at a threshold, and your kind has informed me that the threshold is wherever you decide it is, which means the cost of defeating you is not a number. It is mathematically whatever you are willing to pay, and you appear to be willing to pay everything. I cannot build a war on that. No one can. A war requires a cost you can bear and a victory you can reach, and against you I can find neither. You could just stop, I said. That's an option. People forget it's an option. Yes, he said. I have written it into my recommendation. I did not expect to. When I came down off the gantry at the tank, I thought I was witnessing a remarkable individual, a thing to study, a curiosity for the demarcator's files. I did not think I was witnessing the end of a campaign, but I am an honest accountant, and an honest accountant follows the figures even when the figures take him somewhere he did not want to go, and the figures have taken me to a single line, which I have submitted to the command, and which I will say to you now, because I think you have earned the right to hear it before my own people do. He paused. My recommendation is that we cannot win this war, and that the only rational cost-bearing course is to seek terms. I have recommended that we stop. I did not say anything for a while. It is a strange thing to be told, lying on a pallet on an enemy world, that your broken leg and a cold tank and a woman with her hand on her own wound had between them ended a war that fleets and years had not. I do not want to overstate it. The command had not voted. The war did not end that day. It would grind on, in fact, for a time after I went home, while the factions fought it out in their dry transcripts. But the adjudicant's line was in the record, and the record was sealed and distributed, and once a power zone chief accountant has written that a war cannot be won, the war is already over in the only place that finally matters, which is the place where the people who can stop it have stopped believing they can win it. Can I ask you something? I said. You may. The 8, I said, from my convoy, the ones who switched off, they were your enemies too, the same as me. But you brought their bodies in, and you scanned them, and you put them on a panel, and the demarcator walked me through every one of them like they mattered. Why? You'd already left them for dead in the field. Why bring them in at all? The adjudicant was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, because we are record keepers. It is the oldest thing we are, older than soldiers, older than this war. Before the Mehl fought anyone, we counted things, and measured things, and wrote down how things ended, and we have never been able to leave a death uncounted. It is, I think, the only mercy we have that is genuinely ours. He looked at the floor where the demarcator's panel had rested. And I will tell you something I have not told the command. When the demarcator showed you the 8 and you said they're not human, that's the whole difference. I understood, for the first time in a long career, what we had actually been doing. We had been counting our enemies dead with great care and writing down precisely how each of them ended, and we had never once asked the only question that mattered, which was why this one didn't. We are very good at recording how things stop. It never occurred to us to record a thing that doesn't. I have skipped the walk. I have skipped it on purpose, the way you skip the thing that costs the most to tell. And the Mehl noticed I skipped it too, because Vass came to me on one of the last evenings and said the demarcator had a final request, and the request was that I describe the 11 miles. Not the injury, not the seam, the walk itself, mile by mile, in whatever detail I could give. He wanted it for the record. He said, to understand the shape of the thing from the inside, because the scans gave him the body and the transcript gave him the mind, but neither gave him the hours, and it was the hours he had decided that were the real anomaly. Anyone can endure a moment. The model had no room for the hours. So I told him, I will tell you the same, more or less, because it is the center of the whole thing and I have danced around it long enough. The first mile is the worst and the easiest. The worst because the leg is fresh broken and the splint is new, and every step is a negotiation with bone that does not want to bear weight. The easiest because you are still strong, still full of the chemistry the body floods you with when it breaks, that bright clean fear drug that makes the first mile feel almost possible. You walk the first mile on that. You are stupid with it. You think, I can do this. And the thought is a lie the chemistry is telling you, but it is a useful lie and you let it carry you. The second and third miles are where the lie wears off and the real work starts. The chemistry drains and what is left is just the leg and the distance, and the leg has not improved and the distance is barely changed, and you understand, somewhere in the third mile, exactly how long this is going to take, and exactly how much it is going to cost, and that understanding is the first place a creature switches off. Not from the pain, from the math. From doing the arithmetic of 8 more miles like this and having the body conclude, sensibly, that the arithmetic is unsurvivable and it would be kinder to stop. That is where the 8 died, I think, the ones on the panel. Not in the moment of the wound. In the 3rd mile, at the arithmetic, when the off switch offered them the mercy of not finishing the sum. You beat the 3rd mile by refusing to do the arithmetic. This is the discipline, the real one, the one underneath all the others. You do not let yourself add up the miles, you amputate the future. There is no rendezvous, no 8 miles, no culvert. There is only the next step, and the step after it, and you make the unit of survival so small that the off switch never gets a sum large enough to trip on. The leg can scream over one step. One step is bearable. It is the 8 miles that are unbearable, and so you simply decline to ever hold 8 miles in your mind at once. You hold one step. You have always only ever held one step. The demarcator wrote that down and read it back to me twice and said it was the most important thing I had. Told him more important than the tank, because it was the mechanism. It was how the voluntary threshold actually worked. The human does not endure the unbearable thing. The human cuts the unbearable thing into bearable pieces and refuses to look at more than one piece at a time forever for as long as it takes. The middle miles blur. 4, 5, 6, 7, I could not give him much. Time stopped being a line. The way I said at the start, it became a string of separate present moments, each only as long as the next step, and you do not remember a string of identical present moments any more than you remember a string of identical breaths. I remember the leg. I remember rebuilding the splint twice when the webbing worked loose. I remember a long downhill stretch that was worse than any climb because the leg had to break every step, and breaking is its own agony. I remember talking to myself, out loud low, the way you do, not words exactly, just a sound to set the rhythm to, a metronome made of my own voice. And I remember, somewhere in the 6th or 7th mile, the thing crossing over, the moment the pain stopped being an emergency and became simply the weather of my life, the constant background against which the walking happened, no longer a thing I was fighting, but a thing I was inside of, the way you are inside of cold or inside of dark. That is the crossing. After that, it is not hard exactly. It is just long. The fight is over by the 7th mile because there is no longer anything to fight. There is only the weather and the steps and the small distance that very slowly becomes a slightly smaller distance. And the 9th hour, the demarcator said, when you saw our lights. By the 9th hour, I wasn't deciding anything anymore, I told him. The deciding is the 1st mile. By the 9th hour, you're just a thing that walks. That's all you are. The deciding part of you went to sleep miles back and left the walking part running. And the walking part doesn't know how to stop. That's the secret nobody tells you. The hard part isn't the will. The will runs out in the 3rd mile like everything else. The hard part is what you built before the will ran out, the habit underneath the will, the thing that keeps walking after the willing stops. I didn't will myself 11 miles. I willed myself maybe 3. The other 8 were just the habit walking a body home. The demarcator went very still when I said that. The habit underneath the will. He turned it over for a long time, and then he said something that I have carried with me ever since. Because it was the moment I understood that the trait had stopped being a thing I had and become a thing they feared. Will we understand, he said. Every species has will. Will is a resource. It is spent. It runs out. We have built our doctrine on the running out of will. We wound the body, and we wait for the will to be spent against the pain, and when it is spent, the creature stops. That is sound. That is how it works for every species we have ever measured. He paused. But you are telling me that will is not the relevant faculty. You are telling me that your kind spends its will early, the way ours does, and then keeps moving on something underneath the will. A habit, a training, a structure laid down so deep that it runs without the will to drive it. That the will running out is not the end of the human. That it is merely the moment the human switches over to the thing beneath. He made the tired clicking sound. We have been waiting in every engagement for the human's will to run out. And the human's will running out is not the surrender. It is the gear change. He took that finding to the wider authority himself, the record says, because by then the Mehl were no longer the only ones reading the file. The thing about a sealed and distributed record in a power with that many client species and allies is that it does not stay sealed in the sense of secret. Sealed means finalized, locked against revision, and a finalized record about why an enemy cannot be killed is exactly the kind of document that other species request copies of. The H9 file went out past the Mehl into a mixed authority, a body of several species that coordinated the larger war effort, and it was read there too, and the reaction there is the last thing I will set into this account. because it is the reaction that tells you the trait had done its full work. I was given a transcript of that reading as well. I do not know why they were so generous with their transcripts. I have come to think it was the demarcator's doing, a record keeper's insistence that the subject of a record has a right to read it. In the mixed authority, there were species who had never fought humans, who knew us only as a rumor from the Mehl front, and they came to the reading skeptical, the way you are skeptical of another power's excuse for losing. A war goes badly, and the losing side produces a document about how the enemy is impossible to kill. You read that document with a raised brow. They raise the brow. The transcript shows them raising it. And then they read the curve from the tank, with the Mehl baseline marked and the modeled baselines of 9 other species marked, every one of them crossed, and past the last line a blank region where the chart had no markings and a transcript of a human voice asking, in that blank region, that they take it lower for the sake of clean data. And they read the woman with her hand on her own wound, directing the medics to her squad mate. And they read the demarcator's line with no number, and his note that the freed attention is directed outward, and his final finding that the will running out is only the gear change. And the brow came down. You can see it come down in the transcript, species by species, the skepticism draining out as the document does the only thing a true document does, which has become impossible to argue with. One of them, a delegate from a species I had never heard of, whose name the translator rendered as something like the Seft, asked the question that I think was the real reason the mixed authority had convened to read a Mehl medical file at all. He asked whether the trait was confined to the humans the Mehl were fighting, or whether it was, as the demarcator's note suggested, a property of the species as a whole, whether if his own people ever met humans they would meet this. And the demarcator, who had been brought in to present his findings, gave the answer I had given the adjudicant, the answer I had given freely in the cold, because a lie would have killed more of my people, and the answer landed in that mixed chamber the way it had landed in the tank. He said, "It is the species. We have sampled to and found it in both. And the subject states it is universal, taught from infancy, a discipline laid into the young before they can refuse it. If your people meet humans, you will meet this. Every one of them carries it. The strong ones to the degree you saw in the tank, the ordinary ones to a lesser degree, but all of them past the point where the rest of us stop. I would advise you to assume in any human you ever encounter that the threshold you are counting on does not exist. I have removed it from my model. I would remove it from yours." The Seft delegate did not let it rest there. The transcript shows him pressing, the way a careful mind presses when it has been handed a thing it does not want to be true and is looking for the seam in it. He asked the demarcator whether the trait could be bred out of us or starved out, or broken. Whether a generation of humans raised differently, raised soft, raised to run from the hurt the way the merciful species do, would lose it. It was, I think, the question of a delegate trying to find the version of the future in which his own people would not have to be afraid, and the demarcator, who had spent his whole life refusing himself comfortable answers, refused the Seft one too. "Perhaps," he said, "if you could control how they raised their young for several generations, if you could reach into every human household and stop the mothers teaching the scraped knee lesson. But you cannot. You will never be inside their households. You will only ever meet them on a field, already grown, already trained, the discipline already laid down past the reach of anything you could do to them. By the time a human is across a battlefield from you, the window in which you might have raised him soft closed 20 years ago, on a world you have never seen in a kitchen, with a child and a scraped knee and a mother saying it hurts and it's all right. That is where this trait is made, delegate. Not on the battlefield, in the kitchen, and you have no reach into the kitchen. That answer is in the record, and I am told it is the line the other species remember most, more than the tank, more than the curve. The demarcator telling a chamber of frightened delegates that the thing they feared was forged out of their reach, in a room none of them would ever enter, by an act so small and so universal that no power in the galaxy could find a way to stop it. You cannot interdict a mother comforting a child. You cannot bomb a kitchen you will never locate on a world you will never reach. The trait is made in the one place a war can never go, and it is made early, and it is made everywhere, in every human household all the time, and by the time it reaches a battlefield, it is finished, and there is nothing to be done about it but plan around a threshold that is not there. The Seft delegate, the transcript says, was silent for a long while after that. And then he asked his last question, which was not really a question, more a thing he needed to say aloud to see if it would still sound as bad in the air as it did in his head. He said, "So we are to understand that there is a species which manufactures in its homes, as an ordinary part of raising its children, The precise faculty we have spent this entire war failing to overcome, that it does this without effort, without intent, without even knowing it is doing it. That every human household is in effect a place where the one weapon we cannot answer is quietly produced, in enormous numbers year after year, and that we found this out only because one of them broke his leg and declined to die of it. And the demarcator, the record says, gave the only answer there was. He said, yes, that is what I am asking you to understand. I understand it myself only because I have spent a month understanding it and I am still not certain I have finished. But yes, that is the finding. I would advise you to take it home and sit with it, as I have, until it stops sounding impossible and starts sounding merely true. It took me 3 weeks. You have the advantage of my notes. Perhaps it will take you less. I read that and I set the transcript down, the old man by the window with the crooked leg, and I thought about the kitchens. He was right, the demarcator. That is where it is made. Not in the cold rooms I paid for the far end of it in. Those only sharpen what was already there. The thing itself, the basic gap between the hurt and the panic that every human carries, is made gently by mothers over scraped knees with 4 words said softly. It's all right. The Mehl crossed 9 other species thresholds in a tank and found a blank region past the floor, and the blank region, when you trace it all the way back, is just a mother somewhere telling a crying child that the hurt is only information. They feared a weapon. Weapon was a kindness. They were never going to find their way around it, because there is no way around a kindness that an entire species performs, without thinking, on every child it raises. The exchange came in the gray hour before one of that world's long dawns. They moved me at night on a float pallet down through the culvert hospital past the rows of their own wounded, and I watched the cool blue field lights slide by overhead and thought that I would never see this place again and that I had, against every expectation, become something like fond of it. A field hospital is a field hospital on any world. It is the one building in a war where everyone, whatever their side, is trying to keep someone alive. I had bled in worse places and been treated worse in better ones. Vass walked beside the pallet the whole way. She had asked to. She did not say much at first. The Mehl are not a sentimental people, and a farewell at the edge of a war is an awkward thing for a species whose oldest instinct is to count and record rather than to feel. But at the loading ramp, where her people would hand me to mine, she stopped the pallet and she put one silver hand flat on my chest, over the sternum, the way she had the day she pulled me from the tank, and she said the things she had come to say. I want you to understand what you have done, she said, not the war. The war was always going to end one way or another. Wars do, I mean to me. I have set bones for 40 years. I have pulled creatures back from the edge of their thresholds, and I have lost the ones who went over, and I made my peace a long time ago with the threshold being the wall, the place past which my work cannot reach. It was a comfort in its way. When a patient went over the threshold, I could tell myself there had been nothing more to do, that the wall was the wall and no surgeon could pass it. Her slate eyes held me. You have taken the wall away. You have shown me a creature for whom the threshold is not a wall but a door, and the door opens from the inside, and the patient chooses whether to walk through it. Do you know what that does to a surgeon? It means there is no patient I can ever again be sure I could not have saved. It means the wall I leaned on for 40 years was never a wall at all. Only a thing most creatures agree to treat as one. I will carry that for the rest of my life. I do not thank you for it. But I do not curse you for it either. It is simply true now, and I am a person who would rather know a hard true thing than rest on a soft false one. I put my hand over hers, the human hand over the silver one, and I told her the only thing I had that was worth giving her. You did good work, I said, on the leg. It healed crooked, it'll ache when it's cold, and I'll feel it every day for the rest of my life. And every day I feel it, I'll remember that a 4-armed surgeon I was at war with rebuilt the inside of it for 51 minutes while I asked her stupid questions and didn't have to and did it well. That's the part of this you should carry. Not the wall, the 51 minutes. She made the small clicking sound, the tired laugh. Then she lifted her hand from my chest and she stepped back, and she let my people take the pallet up the ramp, and that was the last I ever saw of Vass the reconstructionist, who set my leg in a field hospital on a world I will not name and who lost on my account the only wall a surgeon is allowed to lean on. I went home crooked. The leg healed the way a leg heals when it is rebuilt well, but the man it belongs to went on using it too soon, which I did, because that is also the trait, and I have never claimed it was always wise. It aches when it is cold. It aches now telling this in a chair by a window a very long way from any war, an old man's leg that an old man rests on a stool and rubs absently when the weather turns, and the ache is the only souvenir I kept, and I would not trade it. The war ended, not that day, not that year, but it ended, and it ended the way the adjudicant's line said it would, in terms rather than in victory, Because a power whose own chief accountant has written that a war cannot be won does not go on paying for the war forever. I am told, I do not know, but I am told that the H9 file is still read in their training, that a Mehl medic learning the trade is shown the curve from the tank and the woman with her hand on her wound and the demarcator's line with no number, and is taught as the first lesson in how to think about humans that the threshold they will count on in every other species does not exist in this one. I am told they teach it as a warning. I find I do not mind being a warning. There are worse things to become. People ask me when they hear a piece of this, and only ever a piece. The whole thing takes longer than most people want to sit, whether I was brave. They want it to be a story about bravery. It is the shape they reach for. Because bravery is a thing they understand and can admire from a safe distance, and the 11 miles fits the shape if you do not look at it too closely. I always tell them no, not out of modesty, out of accuracy. Bravery is doing the frightening thing in spite of the fear, and there was no in spite of in any of it. I was not frightened of the pain. That is the entire matter, and it is not the same as being brave, and the difference is the thing the Mehl finally understood in a cold room and the thing most people never will. I was not braver than the 8 on the panel. I want that on the record too. Here at the end of my own account the way it was never quite on the record in theirs. The 8 who switched off were not cowards. They did not fail. Their bodies did the merciful, sensible, nearly universal thing that bodies do, the thing the demarcators spent 60 years calling a kindness, and it is a kindness. And they were spared the last of the pain by a circuit the universe installs in almost everything that suffers. The only difference between them and me is that somewhere, in cold rooms and on longer marches, in a culture that teaches a child with a scraped knee that the hurt is information and not an emergency, I had been trained out of the kindness. That is all I am. A creature that had the mercy trained out of it young, and learned to keep the gap open between the signal and the surrender, and so could walk 11 miles inside a thing that was built to switch me off. The Mehl thought they were studying a strong man. They were not. They were studying a discipline, and the discipline is the frightening part, because a strong man is rare and a discipline can be taught, and we teach it, all of us to all of our young, without ever once thinking of it as a weapon. We think we are teaching our children to be all right. We are. And we are also the Mehl learned at the bottom of a tank, building into every human who has ever lived the one faculty their entire science of how things end could not account for. The off switch that does not switch, the threshold that is a door, the will that runs out and reveals the habit underneath it still walking. I rub the leg by the window, and I think of Vass, who lost her wall, and the demarcator, who drew a line with no number on it, and the adjudicant, who came down off his gantry on unsteady legs and went home and wrote that the war could not be won. And I think of the question he asked me, the real one, the one underneath all the others, the one a whole alien power had come down inside of him to ask, how many of you can do this? I told him the truth then, and I will set it down again now, because it is the truest thing in this whole account, and it is the thing I would have every reader carry out of it, the way the Mehl carry it in their training, as a warning, as a fact, as the door at the bottom of the tank. All of us, adjudicant, to some degree all of us. You were never going to find the human who feels nothing. That creature does not exist, and you wasted 60 years of lines looking for it. We feel everything, every step of every mile. We just decided, a long time ago, in rooms you would not want to hear about and at the knees of mothers teaching scraped-knee children that the hurt is only information. We decided, as a species, that feeling everything and stopping were two different things. And then we taught our children the difference. And then we sent them to your war.